After a little while of waiting, I have finally had the chance to properly test out the Sony A9 III. And this is a really interesting camera. Lots to talk about, lots to go over. I'll try not to repeat stuff that we've talked about in the past. We obviously did a first look video when this first came out, but now I've really had some hands-on time. Right, I've been out with the 200-600, the new 300mm, we'll have our own video on that lens as well. A few other lenses here and there as well, primarily shooting things like wildlife, shooting some fast-moving things, birds in flight as well. A bit of other stuff, landscape, just because, you know, I was out in a pretty area. I'm not going to not take the photo, but absolutely the main reason you're getting a camera like this, certainly in the A9 range, is the speed. And that is completely true here. The speed is off the charts with this camera. It is outrageous, both in terms of how fast the camera can actually operate, but also things like autofocus, which is frankly, I'll just say it up front, the best autofocus I've ever seen in any camera. It's absolutely outrageous. And of course, we've got a global shutter in here as well. So you probably know a lot about the specs of this camera by this point, a lot about kind of the ins and outs of that kind of stuff. 24.6 megapixel sensor, the global shutter, 120 frames a second blackout free shooting, which I did test out a whole bunch, especially with things like birds in flight and fast moving action. It's really useful. Pre-capture, which you can turn on and is so useful if you're kind of waiting for that precise moment and you want to make sure you definitely don't miss it. I absolutely use that for waiting for birds to start moving so that I actually definitely got that moment where they took off. And of course, the autofocus is absolutely outrageous. Like I said before, probably the best autofocus I've ever seen in any camera. I've used a lot of cameras. It is just stunning to actually use and to watch in real time as it tracks your subjects around the screen, focusing on the eye of a bird while it moves very, very fast, focusing on the eye of my dog when she was moving around, and actually tracking it perfectly. No issues, I don't think even once with autofocus. And that's pretty crazy when you consider the kinds of speed you're shooting at. Okay, so rather than just go over all of the spec and go one by one, let's talk about the things that I really liked about this camera, and then we'll talk about whether there are any things that I didn't love about this camera. So first up, you've got a new custom function button on the A9 III. It's right here, C5. I love having that on the front because it's a very comfortable camera to hold anyway. The grip feels great. The whole thing just feels nice. It's very ergonomic. You know, whether you have your eye up to the viewfinder there, which we'll talk about in a second, because also the viewfinder is lovely. It just fits really nicely with your finger on the front. And actually, if you were to set that to your boost mode, let's say you were shooting at a fairly normal high frame rate, right? Maybe 30 frames a second. That's still extremely fast. You can then use that as your boost mode to just temporarily go up to 120 frames a second. If something's happening, you want to make sure you're nailing that shot. That's how you could set that up. I found that having it set constantly to 120 frames a second was, if I'm honest, a bit much, just in terms of how many shots I would have to go through when I get back to the computer. It's just, that's a lot of shots to look through, right? That's a lot of files and images to check. Whereas setting it to something like 30 frames a second, or even a little bit lower than that if you don't need that kind of high frame rate, and having a boost mode function set to that custom button, you quickly press that, and now you're shooting at 120 frames a second. That works really well with the viewfinder as well, which not only is very high resolution, so you're talking 9.44 million dots, which looks fantastic, and meant that I just wanted to be looking through that all the time. But that is also 120 frames a second in terms of refresh rate. So you are getting a nice smooth, high-res viewfinder, which then works really well with your blackout-free 120 frames a second shooting. It's just lovely to shoot with. I'm personally a big fan of the flip-out LCD screen, which of course flips all the way around. I did use that a little bit as well when I was trying to get the camera really low or up high or something like that into an awkward position. I think that's really helpful. I know some people don't love that as much, but one of the reasons people don't tend to love that as much is because it can affect weather sealing. But this camera is extensively weather sealed, so no problems going out in the rain. I did go out in the rain. I was quite happy doing that. I mean, I didn't love it. I don't really want to go and get super wet, but the camera didn't mind, which is great. You know, if you're shooting sports or wildlife, that's exactly what you want. Okay, so let's talk about the global shutter. Now, if you're not familiar with this already, if you've not seen this somehow already, this has got the first global shutter on a full frame and mirrorless camera. And essentially what that means is that the whole sensor is exposing at the same time. And that actually eliminates some issues just immediately. It means you don't get rolling shutter, so you don't get that kind of weird effect, the classic photo of the person with the golf club, and it kind of looks a bit bendy because part of the sensor has been exposed a little bit earlier than the other part. That doesn't happen. So no rolling shutter at all. So no image distortion, no rolling shutter. That's all good. It also means that you can have, frankly, outrageous shutter speeds. So especially with the new firmware update, we're talking 1/80,000th of a second. That's ridiculous. That's so fast. It's crazy. And for a camera that you're buying that is all about speed, you love to see that. That is absolutely outrageous. And how fun is that to shoot? Now, all of that said, having a global shutter does come with a couple of downsides as well. So for example, the low light performance doesn't seem to be maybe quite as good as we might see on some of the other Sony cameras. So something like the A7R5, it looks like this is just a little bit grainier than on that camera, which, you know, I get it. They're kind of different cameras. You're getting them for different things. And that's something to keep in mind, right? If you want the crazy blistering speed, this is easily the camera to go for. But if you want that absolute image quality, then maybe the A7R5 is the one to look at. That also goes for dynamic range, where you just seem to have a little bit more flexibility, should we say, with photos coming out of something like the A7R5. But, you know, that said, I'm not buying this camera as a landscape or portrait photographer, right? I might do landscape and portrait photography with this camera, but the primary reason I'm going to go for this is sports and wildlife. I want the speed and I want the autofocus, and frankly, I want the best tool for the job, which is this. If I was looking more at landscape photography, more at portrait photography, I would look at something like the A7R5, even something like the A7 IV as well. But I think you're going for this camera for the speed. And at that, it absolutely excels. But this isn't just a photo camera. It's easy to just think of it that way because it has such amazing specs for photography, but actually the video stuff here is outrageous as well. And that's not overly surprising. It's a Sony camera, and at this point they're all hybrid cameras, right? So you've got things like 4K, 60 frames a second, that's oversampled from 6K. You've got 4K up to 120 frames a second. There's no crop there either. 10-bit 422, all eye. You've got things like S-Cinetone. You've got S-Log3. There's a lot to love in this camera if you're shooting video as well. And I can imagine that while, yes, most people are probably going to be looking at the photography side of this camera, it is very useful to have those video specs, because if you are shooting, let's say, sports, and if you are shooting an event like that, it's going to be very useful to be able to quickly switch over to video and immediately start shooting some very high quality, very good video, as well as all of the photos. And that's just the reality of the world that we live in now, is that the expectation is you can do photo and video. And certainly this camera is able to do both at an extremely high quality. For the first time in a good while, this camera has come along and actually kind of wowed me a little bit when I've been using it. It just is that kind of camera, right? That just performs exceptionally well. You pair it up with something like the new 300mm f2.8, and you have this unbelievably lightweight system, which is capable of capturing things just at blistering speed. And it really is, I mean, such a step up from the A9 II. I mean, it's got to be up there as one of the absolute best cameras you could get if speed is the thing you're looking at. If you're looking at wildlife or sports, it's going to be really difficult to beat this camera. I also think that the menus in this camera are extremely easy to get your head around. So actually going in and just using the quick menu to change my subject recognition from animal to bird. So actually shooting my dog Nala, it's very easy to set it to animal and have it just immediately recognize her and track her, and all good. And then I can change it to bird when I see a bird over there and just immediately start doing that. Then, of course, there is actually a setting for animal or bird. So I'll pop it on that. All good. I will say this as well. The speed even goes down to how quickly the camera turns on, which I think is really important, because I was out doing kind of a bit of a hike up on the South Downs, trying to look, if I'm honest, trying to look for a hawk that I had seen when I was out there without a camera. I didn't find it, but I didn't want to just leave the camera on the whole time. I did leave it on for a lot of it, no issues, but I wanted to test how quickly it would start up. If I see a bird moving, how quickly can I turn it on up to my eye and shoot? And it's very, very quick. The speed just runs throughout, switching it on, autofocus, actually taking the photos. It's fantastic. As you can tell, I've really enjoyed using this camera. I've really, really enjoyed it. Now, it's not the cheapest camera out there, absolutely not, but as a tool for a certain kind of job, you're going to be hard pushed to beat it for what it can actually do. And I think Sony are just really nailing it with their cameras, with their lenses. It's really impressive to see. You love to see it, to be honest. Oh, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. You can check out the full spec, the pricing, all the fun stuff, everything you want to know about this camera by checking out the link down in the description. It's got all the info, all of the in-depth spec as well, so you can check out everything over there. Don't forget to like and subscribe because there's new content all the time. I will see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.